Welcome, trail and ultra runners, to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I'm your host, Jason Koop, and on today's podcast, we have somebody with quite a prolific history in trail and ultra running, going back all the way to the early 1990s, Bob Crowley. And Bob, I'm sorry in advance for somewhat kind of outing your age. I don't think you will be offended, but Bob has been around the trail and ultra running scene for many years. He's done races like the Hard Rock, Western States, and then just this summer he did the notorious Tour de Géants over in Italy, and I finally got to meet him in person. But Bob's prolific trail and ultra running career isn't the reason why he is here today. He is also the new president of ITRA, the International Trail Running Association. And as we discuss in the podcast, this is not something that a lot of North American trail runners really have any concept of. And so I wanted to bring him on the podcast and give him a little bit of a floor to discuss what ITRA is all about, what their mission is, and how it can actually improve trail and ultra running as we know it today. I also wanted to take advantage a little bit of Bob's background in venture capitalism, where he works over at the Mustang Group, and discuss what the future of trail running actually looks like. He has his finger on the pulse of this to a great extent, as you guys can all imagine. I found the conversation really fun. I hope that it enlightens everybody out there that is unfamiliar with what ITRA's mission is and what they kind of strive to do with trail and ultra running. So kick back, perk your ears up, and here is my conversation all about ITRA and the future of trail running with Bob Crowley. What's new over there?
Yeah, a lot going on, to be honest. We have a lot of initiatives, a lot of change. It's only been 2.5 weeks. I feel like I've been at this for about 6 years. It's all good. But...
Well, when we got together offline, I described your new role at ITRA as kind of like drinking from a fire hose. But I just read in Ultrarunning magazine, correct me if I get the stat wrong, that only 2 out of 10 people in the U.S. know what ITRA is. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my stat. Yeah, we did a survey, and 2 out of 10 had heard of it.
So maybe it's maybe instead of drinking from a fire hose, it's like drinking from a fire hose in the middle of the forest of which nobody knows anything about.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, one of the advantages of the fact that nobody in the U.S. at least knows what it is that we don't have to undo the brand. We can start new. That's okay because the brand isn't well known, and I'd rather establish it for the first time than to have 10 out of 10 think that UTMB is ITRA, which is what essentially the other 2 that do know what it is. They either think it's ATRA, right, or they think it's UTMB. So nobody really understands in the U.S. what ITRA is. That's 100%. And the 20% that do have it confused with, understandably, because of Michelle's close proximity, that they think they're synonymous with UTMB or they confuse it with ATRA.
Yeah. Do you know what that stat is over in Europe in terms of how many people know what ITRA is?
It's close to 100%.
Really? So, okay. Yeah. So right.
Particularly if you said France, I'd say 90 to 100. If you said Spain, same. Italy, close. It drops off a little bit in Eastern Europe.
You've got this really interesting kind of problem, right? Where it's so prevalent in one area of the world and not prevalent in another area of the world. Why? I can imagine that a lot of this has to do with the European roots, but why does everybody in Europe, or at least all trail runners in Europe, know about ITRA, and yet hardly anybody in the U.S. does?
There's probably 2 reasons. It was formed in 2012 and then officially came into existence 2013. And the original meeting was in Courmayeur, a place you and I both know. And then moved to Chamonix. So the office is in Chamonix. And if you look at the original founders, the large majority of them were French. and there's a couple of non-French. And so, the organization began very, not just Europe-centric, but Western Europe-centric.
Yeah.
In the U.S. in particular, we have a very mature trail running history, 40 years plus, and it's very fragmented. And what I mean by that is there's thousands of races, and those have been started years and years ago by individuals that it started with fat asses, free races, unmarked, and then evolved to charities where people would do a run for fun and maybe raise some money for the landowner or for whoever it may be, a charity. And that's the way we grew up, very fragmented, one at a time. And so 40 years later, if you have an organization like ITRA come along, and if it's perceived that somehow ITRA is trying to organize all of these wild Mustangs, you're gonna have a lot of resistance. And let's face it, there's no voice that represents American trail running. There's no individual, there's no organization that everybody gets underneath and says, yeah, she's speaking for me. It's never going to happen, because you're never going to get thousands of Mustangs rounded up and put saddles on them. It's way too late for that. So if ITRA is perceived by North Americans, and particularly Americans, as some sort of governing body, which it's not, and it's going to mandate rules and regulations and et cetera, then Americans will resist to that, because they'll say, thanks, but we already have that covered, and some. We don't really need any help. It's not what we do, but that's part of our opportunity here in America and then around the rest of the world, is to explain what we do. And I think it will be of great value to the North American market as well as the rest of the world. But needless to say, we have our biggest, our greatest discerning client or customer here is America.
Well, so here you've got the platform right now, because I'm in the 2 out of 10 Americans that actually know what ITRA is, and I would say 100% of that 2 out of the 10 Americans that know who ITRA is has been over to Europe and has had to interface with them in some form or capacity. So as you're kind of like taking on this new role, here's the big platform. When you speak to ultra runners, either individually or in mass, like was what's going to come out on this podcast, like what's your kind of pitch to them on what ITRA is and who you serve and what your primary goals and purpose is going to be as you're moving into North America?
We have 2 mandates, and it's pretty straightforward. One is to teach the values, the ethos of the trail running community, which we believe, and certainly my own experience racing around the world, is the same all over. So kind of one heart, one trail, one heart. We all share the same ethos. So we teach it, and then we try to protect it. And what I mean by that is we've studied other sports. Certainly in my day job is an entrepreneur and now private equity. We study markets and we look for trends. And in trail running, we went back and looked at mountain biking and triathlons. And those were both very small, communities that had deep cultures. And along the way, both those sports grew rapidly, and the values got tossed to the side or trampled. And you ask why, what happened? Well, larger organizations came in and took advantage of the growth and made a lot of money. And they put in their own culture and their own infrastructure. And they really didn't care as much about the ethos as they did about making money. And I'm not, look, I'm a money maker too. So I'm not saying that's bad, but that's what happened. In trail running, we have an opportunity to get in front of that before it's too late, and think that what makes the sport unique and why many of us come to it and then never leave is the ethos and the values. And so we're here to teach those to new members coming into the community, and then to protect them. So work with the larger organizations to make sure that we don't lose the values as they grow. We want them to grow. We want them to come in. We just want to be sure that they understand why those values are so important. Because frankly, if you do, it'll help your business grow better. Because we're very smart trail runners, and we know the difference between somebody that's putting on an event that really is indicative of what we believe, and one that's just trying to, make money. We're very discerning.
Yeah, but at the same time, the mass in trail running right now, as you are very well aware of, and we're going to get into some of the stats and statistics later, is not so big that a bigger company can't come in and just overwhelm the whole system, the whole ecosystem of trail races and trail runners, simply because the number that they're trying to overwhelm is so small. And we're starting to see some of those bigger players starting to come in, like Spartan, who's coming into the trail and ultra scene, and we're also seeing players like Lifetime Fitness kind of come in through the Leadville Trail 100 and others. And I can kind of hark back to the time where Leadville sold that race series to Lifetime. And before I go on, Leadville is a race that is very near and dear to my heart personally. It was the first 100-mile ultra marathon that I did. The race director, Ken Klober, was the officiant of my wedding. It's only a couple of hours away from my house. It was very influential in a lot of different aspects for me personally. And I don't want people to think that I'm like poo-pooing on Lifetime Fitness coming in and buying it. But suffice it to say, I think a general consensus is when those bigger organizations came in, specifically with the example of Leadville, it was a rough transition. I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that. I think the first few years that Lifetime Fitness tried to run this iconic ultra marathon in the Leadville Trail 100, they had their hiccups, and those hiccups didn't need to happen. I mean, there were people and blueprints around and advocates in the area that were trying to steer them the right way, but for whatever reason, it started to go awry. So is that a good analog to something that you are trying to like smooth out with ITRA, is just making, like you said, making those values constantly and consistently communicated like across the board when other entities come into the play?
It's a good beta test, I think. And I'm going to address Leadville and then come back to my running club in New England called the Trail Animals Running Club. Leadville's a great story because it is a case in point in the U.S. where a larger organization, in this case Lifetime, was beginning to work with the traditional race directors that grew up in that world that we know. Very family-oriented, small community. A lot of people would come back to that race every year. It's a tradition, right? And somewhere the ball was dropped in understanding the delicacy of that culture and how important it was to maintain traditions and do things a certain way to keep those people coming back. And for whatever reason that happened, our role at ITRA is to really anticipate potential misunderstandings, or maybe it's just naivety, and to try to work with the organizations and with runners. So, it's grassroots to teach runners. The best way to learn the ethos of trail running is to go out on a trail run with somebody that knows it. That's how we all learn. So that's more obvious. And we have an outreach program to get very grassroots to do that. But for organizations, it's a little different. And there you have to try to get their attention. And rather than them feeling like you're trying to preach to them or that you're trying to hold them back in some way, that there's some secret handshake that only is for the people that come from trail running and not for the outsiders, it's the least thing on my mind. I want these people to come in, and I'll come to that a little bit later as to why, how important they are to our future. But part of the deal, the quid pro quo here, is that we teach them, look, and I'll use an analogy of a church. If you want to join a community, and it's a church, the best thing to do is to come in, you sit in the back, and you sing the hymns, and you read the prayers, and you listen to the preacher. And then you go and have coffee and croissants, and you integrate slowly. That's normal. And you get accepted and you get loved and you get brought in and you're going to feel part of that community pretty quickly. What you don't want to do is rush in through the back of the church and bust open the doors and run to the front and push the preacher off the pulpit and start preaching. And there's a temptation when you've been successful in other marketplaces, financially successful and grown businesses rapidly, to presume that whatever worked in that place, in that particular segment, is going to be carbon copy available and working in another. And in this particular case, trail running has some unique characteristics. If you understand them and appreciate them and take them on board, you're going to have a better business than if you just try to run them over, or you, even worse, try to turn those behaviors to something that you want. You want to bend people to your way. This is not a sport where that's going to go down easy, and it not just in the U.S. Trail runners have been around a long time. There's a long history, and one of the things that we all exhibit in our values is we're very independent, and we're very self-sufficient, and we're very stubborn. And those things work great if you get that, and they can really work against you if you don't understand that. Now, in the trail animals, it's a mid sort of late 80s, early 90s. We started the trail animals, and it's just a local club in Boston. It serves New England, and it started with 10, 20 people. Long story short, there's almost 7,000 members today in trail animals, 12 races, 4,000 runners a year. It's actually a pretty good sized club as trail running clubs go. But when we started to grow rapidly, the founders all sat around and said, let's make sure that we don't allow the growth to overrun the values. And it's the same ethos that we have around the world. And we really made a concerted effort to say, while we're teaching people how to run and how to train and how to eat and how to race, let's teach them the values simultaneously. Let's make the same priority. And, here we are many, many years later, almost 25 years later, and I can put my hand on my heart and attest that the Trail Animals Running Club is no different today than it is back when we had it in the late 80s and 90s. The only difference is we have a huge number of members. But I think to a person, the members understand that the values are to the front, and they teach each other. It's self-fulfilling, right? So if you do that properly, the members teach the other members, and you don't have to. In my church analogy, you don't have to be in the church in the pew every Sunday. You can just learn it all out in the trails themselves. And so that model is another beta test for us to say, can ITRA do this on a global basis? I think they can. I think we can.
And so what does that, so you're kind of charged with, one of the things that you're charged with is bringing ITRA into the North American audience. From a really practical, like ground level perspective, from the viewpoint of a trail runner that's going to one of your trail races or to another trail race that they have there locally, what does that actually look like? What will they notice, or if do they notice anything at all in terms of how ITRA starts to become involved in all of these different numerous and kind of fractured races?
Well, I think it's a great question. Today, there are approximately 70 national representatives, which are people that have been elected to ITRA to represent their region or their territory. And they're charged with being the local representative to go to the races and clubs and help teach people about ITRA, but also remind them about the values. Okay. Does that work? It depends. It depends upon the country and the national representative. I believe ITRA has failed in giving our national representatives a clear mission, and we failed in giving them the proper tools to go out and do what we want them to do. And we're in the midst of correcting that. But I think in the past it's been it's been touch and go. Some national representatives are enormously effective, others, not so much. And there needs to be continuity and consistency there. We also need to spend more time reaching out to the national and regional associations like ITRA here in the U.S. And they're a very, very necessary partner, and we're partners with them. But we don't really do anything more than say that. We need to actually be doing something with them, in conjunction with them. And there's hundreds of ITRAs around the world that are in various countries who know where the trail runners are. They have their own memberships. They're the same members we have. And it seems incredulous to me that we don't embrace them and work with them and figure out how together, right, we can teach and reinforce these values. So that's another area that we have to improve, and we will. Another one, frankly, is the brands. So brands are interested in trail running because it's growing at a click of about 10% or so a year, and it has been for the last 10 or 15 years. It's the only part of running in the world that's growing consistently. Rest of running is flat to down. Trail running's growing. And so that always attracts the attention of a good brand because there's an opportunity to sell their goods and services. But again, we want to make sure the brands understand our ethos, and that when they have outreach to our athletes and to our runners, that it's all done as part of the community. And so they can be an asset for us to reach out to the runners, when we can also help them understand what are the kinds of products and services you want to bring to the market that will resonate, right, with this kind of trail runner, with this ethos. So that's another area where we probably haven't worked in as close in conjunction with the brands, but we will. And the last, of course, is the race organizers, as we started this discussion. And not to go back over that, but it's obvious that we need to work with the thousands of races that exist all over the world, and the hundreds, if not thousands, of race directors, so that they can put on safe, fair, enjoyable, fun events, fill their rosters, as many runners as they see fit, and that at the end of the day, the athletes finish and say, that was a great race and this was a great event, but it's the community that I'm really turned on by. It's when I get to the finish line and everybody's like sitting around and waiting for me or cheering me on. I'm a nobody, and yet I feel like somebody, and I'm on the track with a lot of somebodies, a lot of like world-class athletes that are either out there with me or they're sitting there at the finish line and they're giving me a high five and they're telling me what a great job I did. That's pretty unique in this world of sports. And we don't want to lose that under any circumstances, because, it draws us in and it keeps us in.
So you have this like multi-level approach where you're reaching out to like the more national organized, or the more nationally kind of recognized organizations like ITRA. You're reaching out to the brands who have presence both here in the US domestically and then also abroad. And then you're also reaching out to the individual races. And I've got this matrix now going in my head where the last group, the races, all the wild Mustangs, Mustangs, is that the analogy you used earlier? Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. All the wild Mustangs that are out there, that's the one that poses the greatest challenge, but also the greatest opportunity, because they are the first, last, and primary touch point with the actual athletes that are participating in the sport. Yes, the brands have the influence, and yes, ITRA has a certain influence, but at the end of the day, runners go to a race and they have an experience at that race that either tells them, hey, I want to continue to be a part of it, I'm going to continue coming back to this church, or you know what, this church isn't really for me. I really didn't like, where I was sitting in the pew, and I didn't like the pastor's message and things like that. Is that the way that you're viewing it as well, that this latter part, like the races, I wouldn't say it's the linchpin, but it's definitely the most intriguing of those levels of communication and outreach?
Right. Yes, it serves, organizers serve a couple of purposes. And as a coach, and having listened to many of your podcasts, obviously our athletes, runners, are motivated by having a goal. And in trail running, it's being able to train for an event and then compete in that event and hopefully accomplish whatever goal that you've set. So one thing that these organizers do is set up goals and give people, milepost out there somewhere to shoot for. The other thing they do in the church analogy is bring the communities together every once in a while and essentially celebrate.
Yeah.
And in that celebration, you really get a sense for what the bigger community is like. And it's pretty joyous. And you either really walk away from that feeling that sense of way beyond what you expected, which was, I hoped for a result, I got my result, or I didn't. But wow, I wasn't expecting this whole other feeling of like, I want to do that again. And I want to be part of this. There's something going on here that maybe I didn't experience in another sport. And I'm not exactly sure what it is yet, but I want some more of that. And so those two things happen at races. And if they're well run, the feedback to the race director is usually dual. Great event, well organized, the markings, the infrastructure, the volunteers, the medical support, terrific. That's all on the quantitative side. But a lot of the best race directors also hear, and the people out there, the amount of support I felt, the amount of love and joy that was there, the runners that I met from everywhere, yeah, that was actually even better. So that's the part that is critical to this community, because if we didn't have the races, we would have trail running. Most of us spend a lot of time alone, listening to nature or listening to podcasts or books or whatever, and maybe your running mate. But it's a pretty solitary sport. And so it's only at these times that the communities get together and gather do you really get the full sense that you're part of something bigger. And that's a pretty critical part of building communities, right? If you think about society, if you didn't have places to gather every once in a while, it's not nearly as tribal, right? As whether it's around a fire or it's in a church or it's a bigger environment, that's a pretty fundamental thing to society.
Well, and we have a blueprint for that going on right now. I mean, the races are gone, right? This tribal, communal, very experiential happening that are races where everybody gets together, they have a common experience, we give everybody hugs afterwards, high fives, and there's a big accomplishment at the end of the day, celebrated with a beer and a belt buckle or whatever. Like, those are not going to happen for the near future. And to timestamp this a little bit, we're recording this on April 29th. So it's right in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of my fears that I want to get your take on, one of my fears is that if the lack of races is prolonged to a certain extent, I agree with you that we're going to continue to trail run. We're going to continue to meet our mates and our training partners when we can out on the trails. We're going to continue to run out on the trails. And if anything, the uptick in the outdoor activity that we've seen, I take it as a good thing, as much as people like to complain about this being more crowded, that being more crowded, there's more people out on this summit or whatever. I think overall that this is going to be a net positive. But my fear is if that linchpin of the community, which are the races, if we go for a long enough period of time without having that communal and tribal gathering aspect during those races, I'm not going to say that the community is going to deteriorate, but I do feel for the health of it in terms of how many people are participating, how many people get enjoyment out of it and things like that. I was wondering if you had any kind of comments on that aspect, because we're actually having a test tube scenario of that playing out right now.
I certainly have a viewpoint, and it's pretty encouraging for me. When I first was introduced to trail running back in the late 80s, out in California first, then back in Boston with the trail animals. It was very small. So we're talking about very small groups that would meet up and we'd just go trail run. We weren't really racing that much. It was just, enjoying each other's company. And I was quite happy. It was very satisfying. It was very fulfilling. And so when we raced, and it wasn't that often, it was fun to get together. And essentially what happened back then was you almost knew everyone. So
Right.
it really was like going to some local community activity. But it wasn't that I had to do it. It was just nice. It was a nice to have. Now, I think as we've grown as a sport, the competing part in racing has grown in stature. And so to your point, yeah, if we took it away now, if we never could race again, if we had to just go back to being in small groups and just running on the trails and enjoying nature and enjoying each other's company, would it completely disseminate? Would it annihilate trail running? No, it would decrease the membership for sure. But I don't think that's going to happen, number one. And two, I believe that we're showing the resilience that trail runners possess in this current COVID situation with a lot of innovative alternatives from coaches, from the athletes, from the organizers, and saying, look, we're going to continue to run. We're going to find a way to run, and we're going to find a way to reach out to each other. Even if it's electronically, we're still going to do it. And when this is over and when we are allowed to come back out and play with each other again, it's going to be that much more fun. I really believe that. And I believe every trail runner in their soul believes that. And I think we will have that day will come. It'll come in fits and starts for sure. It's not going to be a light switch on. As our governor here in California says, it'll be a dimmer. But as we come back, we will gain courage and we'll gain enthusiasm, and the landscape will have changed. So the runners won't have changed. That we'll only be joined by a considerable amount of new faces that are coming from the likes of Spartan and obstacle course racing, and likely coming from triathlons and Ironman, and likely coming from families that have been out enjoying nature, maybe for the first time, because they've been shut in and they needed the fresh air. And so they go out and they have walks and they hike and realize, hey, this is actually something we want to do post-COVID. So there's a lot of sources of new trail runners coming. So I'm really encouraged by the growth potential. What is discouraging and really tough to swallow is seeing so many of our colleagues suffering that are race directors. And many of them, it is their livelihood. And it's there are no clear answers to the problems that they're encountering. And there's not a particularly good timeline. So what happens is some of them may decide that it's not the right thing to continue to try to do, and may go to something else in their life. And that will create a supply and demand inequity where we have a lot of runners coming in. That's the demand, and maybe not as many races available. And that will create a temporary vacuum. And that's where the likes of the bigger operators will look at that and see there's growth. And now there's actually a playing field here that we can fill the void, and let's step into that. And I think you'll see that. That's a natural evolution of a business that has gone through somewhat of a setback and now will come back roaring. And that's why having a clear understanding as those operators come into our sport, that they understand our ethos and understand that it is important to just not trample, to run to the front of the church and start preaching, but to really try to understand why we do this, and to mirror that in the events that you put on for us, so that you begin to adopt our values and we begin to appreciate the way you put on a professional event. and we can live and cohabitate quite nicely together and not ruin the community in the process. And by the way, I believe as a business person, if you understand that, you'll make a lot more money than if you misunderstand it and you have an attempt to sort of ready, fire, aim, and kind of have your gun handed to you.
So is that your buy-in right now with the Ironmans and with the Spartans that are starting to get into the sport? It's like, hey, listen, it's good for your business too. Like, not only are you going to fit into the church, fit into to the community better, but make no doubt about it, they're coming into trail running to turn a profit. I mean, they're a business, they have to expand their business. And I completely agree with you that there's going to be this vacuum on the other side of this pandemic where race directors are just going to fold up their tent and go home because they don't want to do it, either because they took a huge loss. And let's be honest, like, you can provide some perspective on this as well through your organization. In many cases, being a race director is a really thankless job. It's not very well paying. The margins are very low, if non-existent, or you're taking a bath on it, or you're doing it for charity and things like that. And yes, the community is good about thanking their race directors and things like that, but it's a tough gig. Very few people get into it to be a gazillionaire, and there's going to be a lot of people that look at the adversity that they are now facing with not being able to bring in revenue to put their races on and go, you know what, my time is better spent elsewhere. And then therefore the kind of the vacuum is created. So back to my original point with all that, what are the buy-ins that you are using to communicate to some of the organizations that are coming in order to help them understand the community?
Right. So it's pretty straightforward. If the reason that you're paying attention to trail running is to grow your business, then you're measured on how well you grow the business. Ultimately, it's profits and it's revenue. But at the end of the day, if you spend a lot of money to go after a market and it fails, you get an F. If you wisely spend your time and your money and it really grows well, and you see it on the top and bottom line, then you get an A. And this is a sport that has fairly deep roots in terms of what it believes and why people do things. And yes, there is an enormous amount of growth that has come in the last 10, 15 years. That would be from predominantly millennials, with an increasing number of women. And so the demographics of the sport have shifted from the days when we did put on free races for charity, and it was a smaller community. That group is aging out. I'm part of that group. And not aging out, but we're in the minority now in terms of the number of people in the sport. So if I'm a global sports event operator, I'm looking at the demographics and I'm looking at what kinds of things do those runners want, and what they want are experiences. They want really good experiences, and they understand the difference between quality and just having something that's thrown at them. They also understand the need and the desire to want to have an organization giving back, helping the greater good. That's a very important part of the demographic. And so we have an opportunity to do all of those things. If you just take a breath and understand why people are here, you can put together events that reflect all of that and more. And that's a good thing for them because they're going to grow their business faster and they're going to be more sustained. And it doesn't interfere in any way with our mission at ITRA. In fact, all we do is help them. We're not here to tell people what the rules are. We're not here to tell people how to make money. That's up to the community to decide that for themselves. Our real goal is to make sure that they understand. And 10 years from now, if we look back, the measuring stick for ITRA will be, are the values as prominent then, 10 years from now, as they are now? And that's what we've always measured trail animals by, is 25 years later, can we really put our hand on our heart and say that people understand the values and they're as important to them now as they were when we were 30 people? And I honestly believe that's the case. So that's why I have so much hope that regardless of you can't stop the growth. We could sort of circle our wagons and decide that nobody's in and that's it. We've had enough. But we're not going to do that. And you can't stop it. So you have to understand the growth. You have to embrace it. And then you have to try to figure out ways in which you can coexist. And it's really not more complicated than that.
Yeah, I appreciate those goals, and I really appreciate, like, from what a business perspective we would call values-based KPIs, right? Your key performance indicators for ITRA are values-oriented, not necessarily, okay, we're going to grow from 600,000 to a million to 1.2 million participants, and it's X amount of revenue and things like that. I think that part of it, having that alignment, is incredibly critical.
Absolutely. Now, we have staff, and we have mostly volunteers, so almost all volunteers, but we have staff and we have some expenditures as a nonprofit. So we make that by having members, both organizers and runners. And in that case, there is a presumed exchange where if we ask someone for €1 or $1, they will get something in return for that. And our other mission is to be the reference for our sport, for our community. And what that means is it would be nice if runners from around the world had one place to go to find answers to the questions they have about our community. And that could be gear, it could be medicine, it could be research, it could be training, nutrition, races, all of the above. Right now, it's pretty fragmented. Again, if you want to ask those questions, you might Google it. So you do natural search, or you may go to social media. But it's scattered, and there's an enormous amount of great things going on, but there's no really central place. And one of the things that we'll try to leverage in the future is technology, and that's a good timing, because that's my background. I come from technology, and so I've always viewed technology as the foundation of anything that's to be built, because you can scale things, you can rapidly be addressing the needs of the market, and you can be very agile. Really, three important aspects. And ITRA is a little behind the curve on technology. We have a lot of good technology, but we could have better. And I think with a few turns of the screwdriver and a couple of swings of the hammer, we can have what I believe is going to be potentially one of the most innovative sports organization platforms in the world. And that's coming soon. And what that will allow us to do is then come back to the topic of a reference. And we really want to be the combo kayak. So kayak never does the transaction. If you're looking for tickets, for airplane tickets, you search and you find the best deals, and then kayak says, okay, this is the one you want, and they'll send you off to Delta Airlines, right? And that's where you finish the transaction. So they have a purpose there, which is to be in the middle of an exchange. So that's one model, and the other is Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia is so powerful because its content comes from millions of people, and particularly people that really know what they're talking about. Well, we have literally millions of trail runners, and we have thousands of suppliers of information. And our goal will be to be the exchange, so that if you have a question about, and it'll be geo-ontology, meaning be able to get your question down to where you are. So if you're looking for a trail or a running mate or a running store or a coach or information about an injury you have or a particular race, on and on and on, we will build the exchange. We'll call it the ITRA exchange, which would allow you to ask the question. And then we're going to use really good search and good metadata to then get it down to a few places that have the answer. If it's looking for a coach, ideally CTS will be one of those answers. And then you click through and say, here are 3 or 4 resources that really fit your search. Go to visit their sites, connect with them, and they will take care of answering the questions that you have. Now, that's a very valuable resource. And in the future, when we build that, we believe that's a fair quid pro quo again for a membership. For example, having runner insurance, where if you travel overseas and you race, and particularly if you're racing in, it actually, by the definition of most insurance policies that come with travel, they exclude any sort of sport or danger, right? Anything that's considered extreme, they're excluded. So you have to get a rider that specifically addresses extreme sports. We offer insurance at huge discounts to our runners if you just become a member. We have a performance index. So we rank 1.8 million runners around the globe, from 1 to 1.8 million. And they're ranked based upon their performance and which kind of race they race in, which we have a rating system, which is also done across thousands of races. And that's a way for brands to figure out what athletes they might want to make ambassadors or put on their team. It's used by race directors to decide who they might want to provide an invite to, or maybe give a free pass and invite the athlete to come race. It's used by researchers, magazines, people that write about the sport to kind of decide who's the best in the world. And it's used by the athletes themselves for their own measurement of where do I fit? Where do I rank? Am I moving up? Am I moving down? Who am I going after on this list, in my future? So it's a pretty valuable tool. Those are all the kinds of things that are behind the membership if you want to have access to them. And it's pretty straightforward stuff. So in summary, we have the values mandate that we talked about. We also have the mandate to be the reference. And we've got some work to do, for sure. But at the end of the day, if I come back to North America, and particularly America, and we can go one-on-one with an American trail runner and say, this is what ITRA does for you on the values and ethos side, and this is what we do for you on a service side. These are things that we really think you're going to be interested in. And for that, we would like your membership. If we can do that over and over again, and it's a genuine, even value proposition, then we can grow our membership by tenfold. And if we do that, we'll have more than enough income to do the things that we want to do, both on the ethos side and building a better and better reference resource. So again, it self-fulfills. And you're right. We're not trying to make millions and millions and millions of euros or dollars. We're not trying to build, some gigantic organization. And by the way, we are not a rules body. We don't set the rules. We don't determine for people, how to do it. And we don't tell people what to do. That's not our job. And so it's a pretty efficient organization, to be honest with you. Right. It's very distributed, not that complicated.
Yeah, but the references piece of it is quite intriguing because I can tell you just from my experience being out in the space and being a coach, I get questions all the time on which race should I do? What coach should I find? What's a good product for this? What advice can I go over here for that? And the reason I've always appreciated being able to answer that question because I can drive them into coaching, right? That's what I do for a living. But my first thought is somehow the massive search engines have failed that individual because I'm not their first line. Something else is their first line. They're going to Google whatever they're looking for before that. And sometimes the sheer volume of information is overwhelming. And if some way, this is why this is intriguing, if some way ITRA is curating that and presenting it to the athletes and the runners that are out there in a logical fashion that kind of acts as like a pre-filter. That part of it is actually quite attractive because of this extremely fractured nature that we have within trail running, where the information on all of the different races and everything is just everywhere.
That's right. And that really is what we're going to do. So it's not that hard. You need to have the right technology stack, or what we call platform, and it needs to be extensible and modern and scalable. It needs to be multilingual. So, when you try to go into new countries that are double byte language, like Cantonese, Arabic, today, there's a problem when we get race results and they're in double byte language. They're not anglicized or Latin. And we have to then convert all of that. And there's a lot of manual innovations. Well, if you have an open system, you can then ask the people that make those converters for a living and attach them to our, if you will, our campus of technology, and immediately just make the ask, and then we get it back. They do it for us. And so we can then allow the more difficult regions and the more complicated problems to be solved locally. That's technology. Now let's go back to content. We don't want to amass the content. All we want to do is act as an exchange. So there are really good sites today that provide medical advice to trail runners. They're out there all over the world.
I agree. They're hard to find.
They're hard to find, but they're there, and they're really, really good when you find them. So rather than asking the question, I always use the, at Trail Animals, we have almost 7,000 members in our Facebook page or group. And when someone asks a question, let's say it's about an Achilles heel, and they say, I just got diagnosed with level 3 Achilles heel. What do I do? And our community is very, very gracious with providing answers. And that athlete will get 60 responses from our club members. And some of those answers might actually be coming from a PT or a doctor. And some of them may be coming from someone that's had a grade 3 Achilles heel problem before and what they did. And some of it might be, things they learned in the woods in Wives' Tale. You get all of that, and that athlete now has to process 60 different answers,
right,
and determine, well, which one of these actually is the right answer. It's tough. There is no Yelp, right? Yeah. And so what we'd like to do is take that same scenario and have them come to ITRA and put in, I'm in Boston. I have a grade 3 Achilles heel problem, and I'm seeking an answer. I'm seeking advice, and then I'm probably seeking therapy, right? And we want to be able to use our engine to put you right at the doorstep of probably 3 or 4 solutions that are going to be in your backyard with the right answers, and hopefully, in that case, it might be a PT, right? It shouldn't be that hard. And that information exists around the world. It's just we've got to be able to pull it together. Now, how do you get that content in there? Well, if we have a federated technology, we're going to have people in the Boston area that will want to volunteer and say, let me have that little piece of the world because I know it and I'm motivated. Think Wikipedia now, and I'll keep it up. I'll make sure that the links and the curation is done really, really well because that's my little part of the world. That's my contribution to giving back. If we multiply that times thousands of people around the world that really know what they're doing in their respective regions, all we do is provide them the platform. But it's a federation of people actually contributing. It's the same philosophy that we do on the ethos and the values. We're just applying it now to information. But it's exactly the same model.
Right.
And so that's a to-do, Koop. It's not something we do today. But it's not that far in our future, and it is something that I think we're all really excited about at ITRA, and we hope that the community will find it a really useful service.
Well, I think you're kind of underplaying the enormity of the task a little bit, and I've got a huge grin on my face right now if that's not coming through the audio. why don't you describe to the listeners, like, what does the organization actually look like? Like, how many people are there? Where are you all located? And I think that'll give a sense of why I'm grinning so much, because it seems to me, from me knowing your organization, that you have a lot of great folks, a lot of which I've had interaction with, but compared to the magnitude of what you have just described over the last 40 minutes or so, that's a tall ask for the staff that you have. So who do you have? Where are they, just in general terms? And am I thinking about this outlandishly that it almost seems too big for its britches?
There's 1.9 million runners. To start with, what do we serve? And we serve the runners. They're at the forefront of everything we do. There's 1.9 million people that's performance index have been indexed. There's about 200,000 runners that are, registered members of ITRA right now, and there's about 3,500 race organizers. So it's pretty good size, and 32,000 races. So it's pretty good size organization today. The organization has traditionally been based in Chamonix because Michel Paletti, my predecessor, has been the founder, co-founder, and president of the organization since its inception in 2013. So he was there 7 years, and it made sense to have it there in Chamonix. It actually cohabitated offices for a number of years with UTMB. So there's a small group of people, a handful of half a dozen people in Chamonix, in the Chamonix region, that are now staying at home, of course, and working as full-time staff. We call them our professional team. With Michel's departure and in my election, we have shifted the way that ITRA is structured, simply because we're trying to prepare for what we call Chapter 2, or ITRA 2.0, right? The first chapter were the first 7 years, and it grew rapidly. And Michel and his team just can't say enough good things about what has been created here. But now the sport's accelerating even more. As we talked about earlier, the texture of who's going to be providing organizations and races is going to change. And so we have to prepare for that. And we also need to get back to the basics of making sure that we are teaching and protecting the values and being this reference that is in our charter. And the two big differences will be technology will be at the core of everything we do going forward. And that, am I biased? Of course I am. I mean, I don't know how to do anything, even play a guitar, without technology. So it's just in my DNA. And two, we really are going to be in a distributed world where it is more like Wikipedia, where we have a lot of people holding up their hands saying, I want to be part of this movement of ITRA. How can I help? Like, I really want to help. And up to now, it's been hard to figure out how to onboard people. Tomorrow, it's not going to be hard at all. It really is going to be pretty straightforward, and we will take that help and some. And so rather than a few people trying to do remarkable things, we want a whole lot of people doing small, remarkable things that add up to something big. And if it all comes back to a really well-built technology platform, then we can do it. Now, who do we use for that? How do we do that? Well, we'll be using third parties for sure.
Yeah,
we're not a software company, so we'll use trusted partners to help build a very modern infrastructure, and then that will allow us to bring on other third parties into our world. I use the analogy a lot with our team as a college campus. Imagine having the piece of land and all of the campus architected with all the different buildings, the classrooms and the dormitories and the university center and the library and the medical center. But you only start to build, one dormitory and one classroom. All right. And you have the map and the buildings all match. And we built the first two. And then as time goes on, you build the commissary, you build the university center. And some of those buildings, like the medical center, might be built by a third party because they're specialty at building medical centers, right? And so, but it all still matches. It all fits on the plot map, and it all is tied together. that's exactly what our vision for the future of the technology is we're not going to do this alone. We're going to have a lot of help, both in the content and creating the exchange, but also in the technology that we use to translate, the technology that we use to reach deep into markets that are more complicated, like China.
Right.
A tremendous market opportunity for us, but not without its unique characteristics that need to be done inside out, not outside in. And there's many other markets that we hope to help grow trail running in that have similar unique aspects to them, and so on. And even in this COVID period now, our thinking is turning towards what can we be doing in the next 30 days to help our runners and to help our organizations prepare to come out. And then what can we be doing during that coming out period, which is definitely going to be months. Again, it's going to be the dimmer coming on slowly. Right. What can we do to keep them informed? What are the tools and ways in which we can help the community come back to life? And we have time to put the infrastructure in place. We have time to think about what are the most valuable services. And then when things are running, hopefully the new normal, well, then we'll hit our stride. And it's no different than training. If the aspiration is to train for 100, we gotta put the training in now. And we all get that, because that's every single person that I'm involved with at ITRA is a trail runner. Every single person that holds their hand up out in the field is a trail runner. And we don't have to talk about the ethos. We don't have to talk about tenacity and grit and knowing how to come back, because it's what we do. And so the beautiful thing is you can go right to, well, what do you got? What do you need to do? Right. And we can cut through all the normal translations and just say, here's a thing we need done. And we can rely on those people to do it. And that's the power of, serving the trail running community. This is a pretty talented group of individuals, both in their physical skills, but also their mental toughness, their tenacity, their ability to take on responsibility and do things. I mean, very few of your athletes, I'm sure, just get up one morning and decide to go run a 50, probably against your good counsel. Some do. But most of them have to plan, they have to train, they have to put a lot of time into ultimately achieving their goals. So we're riddled in a good way with all that talent. And our role is to try to figure out how to marshal it for the good of ourselves, right? This isn't like for some profit-making entity. We're doing all these things to make our own community better. And people really get turned on by that.
Yeah, and just like a trail ultra runner uses crew to help, or they leverage their crew to help improve their performance at a race, pacers, people at aid stations, and things like that. It seems like you guys are leveraging people outside of ITRA to get your mission accomplished. And some of that leverage comes from the community itself. I mean, if the community is providing a lot of the content and the answers that then get put into this curation funnel that you guys that you are building, it kind of almost serves this dual purpose, because it takes the burden off of your limited staff, but also still maintains that ethos of being a community centric service, where the answers and the information is actually coming from within the community versus outside of the community.
Well, let's use the example that we both experienced in the Aosta Valley in Italy last.
Oh no! Here we go.
We had to bring it up.
Yeah,
so
here we go.
Look, it is 900 plus or minus runners. How many tens of thousands of people are there in the form of crew, in the form of volunteers, in the form of all of the people from all of the towns and all of the infrastructure to put on that event that essentially are probably 10x. So it's 9,000, maybe more, that aren't doing the race. But somehow, some way, they're putting in ungodly amounts of hours, happily, gleefully, as we saw, joyfully. Yeah. And, that's an extension of one trail runner times 10 times whatever. that is the attraction of this community, is why are race directors surrounded by all these volunteers?
Right.
And the answer is because they have the same feeling that's being thrown off by the community as we do as actual runners. And that right there is the ethos, and that right there is what makes it special. And coming all the way back to why is ITRA here? It's to make sure we don't lose that, because if we do, then race directors have to start paying people to do all that stuff. And athletes have to start paying people to be crew and pacers. And it all starts to feel very corporate, and nowhere in there is room for, the ethos. So we under any circumstances can't let that happen.
Yeah, I've always thought about it in terms of the impact that that happens as a person doing a race always goes far beyond that person locomoting for 50 miles or 100 miles, or in you and I's case in Tour de Géant, however long that course ended up being. I thought it was like 230 miles by the end.
Always measured in days, right?
Yeah, exactly. Multiple days. But that impact, no matter how you measure it, whether you take the really cliche economic impact, which a lot of race directors like to do, or you just take the social impact or emotional impact or inspirational impact, it always goes far beyond one person actually locomoting those miles, or one person traveling to an area and spending money on a hotel and at the restaurants and things like that. There's this multiplier effect that always happens whenever you have these community races that I 100% agree with you. The Tour de Géants, it has that on steroids, just because of how involved everybody does have to be to pull that race off. All the communities and all the towns and all the volunteers and the people that are shuttling the yellow bags and the medical staff and the support people that come from all over the world to support their friends and family. I mean, it just becomes this huge ecosystem of people that it takes to pull that race off.
I have the privilege of being down the street from Western States Trail. And so, needless to say, very involved and very committed to that event as well. One of the things we established a few years ago was when the international athletes come to Western States, we offer them pacers and crew, and we offer them a roof over their head by Auburn Ultrarunning families that will provide them a bed and a hot meal, some logistics, show them the trail, all to really make them feel at home and reduce their stress level. It's hard enough coming all that way and training for the race of their life. The response to that has been interesting. The athletes love it because it does reduce their stress, and they meet these wonderful people and families. And so it's a really nice community and way to show off the American trail running ethos and spirit. But what we didn't expect was that the families are equally grateful. Yeah. Because they've met these remarkable people, and they remain friends over the years. Needless to say, are invited to the homes of the athletes. So if they're from Bolivia or Portugal or from Hong Kong, they're invited to come and stay with them and show them their trails and show them their beautiful country and countryside. And that connection is it's a little almost inexplicable how deep it is. So that kind of exchange, for instance, if you come back to our ITRA exchange, imagine being able to connect runners that way around the world.
Yeah.
So if you 100%. Want to go to Hong Kong and you want to find the trails and find someone to run with, and maybe even stay, in a post-COVID world, we got to figure this out, but maybe even stay right at someone's home. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
And wouldn't that sort of reinforce who we are? And I think that's all within our reach. The staying under someone's roof in a post-COVID world, well, that one we got to figure out. But the rest of it, is all at our fingertips with a little bit of ingenuity, a little bit of effort. And boy, doesn't that sound like somebody training for a 100-miler.
100%. Okay, we're going to pivot away from ITRA just a little bit for this final section that I want to talk to you about. But before we do, how would people learn more? How do people start to become engaged with ITRA? Because we started out this podcast with this North American audience, and this podcast mainly has a North American audience. They're probably not even going to know what the letters in the acronym are. That's another survey you could take right there. So how does our uninformed North American audience learn a little bit more about ITRA?
ITRA.run.
That's where it starts. All right. We'll just leave it there at the website. Anything else you want to say before we get into some
your membership?
Okay. All right. Let's pivot a little bit because I'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of like two really unique aspects that you can bring to the listeners. The first one is you, as you mentioned in the podcast, you've been trail and ultra running for a long time, almost since some of the major origins of the sport, particularly in the US. And so you've seen a lot of change, but also you've been very successful on the business side and been able to predict markets, and in particular endurance markets, where they're going to ebb and where they're going to flow. Every year, Ultrarunning magazine comes out with their statistics on how many people are participating and what that participation looks like, male versus female, 50K versus 100K and 100 mile. And that's something that I know that you've had a keen interest on a number of different levels as well. And so I'll open the floor up to you. If we look forward 5 to 10 years from now, what are the big things that trail and ultra runners are going to see that are different compared to what they are now?
Okay. Starting with the runners, the participation rate. So trail running's been growing approximately 10% a year for almost 15 years. So
that's incredible, by the way. That right there is mind blowing for that long.
The number of events has also been rapidly growing. And in fact, our research shows that there was an imbalance of too many races, so too much supply, and over the demand. And, that's not uncommon in growing markets. It's a shiny object. And so it attracts a lot of interested parties because everyone figures, hey, it's the gold rush. He's got a nugget. That guy's got a nugget. I know what he does. He's not any better than I am. I can get a nugget too. And we had a lot of nugget seekers, and some of them are really, really good, and some of them aren't so good. And what the COVID has done is it's going to, as Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, right, you see who has their bathing suits on.
I love it.
And we got a lot of naked people, and that's going to hurt.
Yeah.
That's going to hurt, and it's going to create the vacuum that we talked about. Our research shows that post-COVID, that there's no reason, just like the economy was raging along, and the reason we have an economic problem on our hands isn't because there was something wrong with the economy. Well, the same goes for the growth of trail running. The trail running will resume at 10%, but we actually think it'll be higher than that. And why? Well, there's 3 or 4 sources, and I mentioned all of them earlier in the podcast. One will be the millions of people that have discovered the great outdoors, and post-COVID will go, well, I was doing it because we kind of had to, just for peace of mind, and we couldn't really go that far from our home, and so we went outside and got some fresh air. But, we really enjoyed it. And I wonder if I did this like as a habit now, what kinds of things could I do? Could I find hiking clubs, nature clubs, orienteering, trail running, etc.? And trail running will be on the list, and it will benefit from people seeking part of the community, joining groups locally to say, hey, I'd kind of like to learn how to do this, and where do I go? And again, if we had the appropriate exchange, it would be very easy to get an answer to that question. So we think there's millions of people around the world that are in a category of going to start paying attention to trail running. We think that we know China is growing pretty rapidly, very grassroots. These are people that share precisely the same values as everybody else. We know that Spartan has put their foot into the sport, and they will leave it there. And they are bringing with them nearly 1 million obstacle course race athletes. And Ironman, as we know now, is bringing back to the U.S. Ironman. And with that, they have Tarwar, and they have Ultra Trail Australia already in their portfolio. And I believe because trail running is growing, they will pay attention to trail running. And I think we'll see them as a citizen as part of this. UTMB has now UTMB International, and they're growing across the globe. We haven't seen Active yet. We haven't seen Lifetime. We haven't seen 3 or 4 other international sports event organizers, but they're out there. And it would not surprise me if you see some of them come in, and some startups, by the way, some executives that come off of some of these other events and say, hey, this is a great play here to fill this vacuum and to build something specifically for trail running. So that will all kind of even up the supply and demand with a little bit more consolidation on the supply. In other words, fewer players, bigger players, plenty of room for the mom and pops and for the 1 and 2s. I'm not saying they're going away. I'm just saying there will be some consolidation. And that all breeds one thing: growth. And it breeds serious players, serious brands, and a lot of trail runners, getting out there. And we're going to be reaching out into parts of the world that want to emerge, that don't have organized trail running. They don't have a club. They don't have an association. And part of what we're doing is reaching out to those communities and saying, well, let us help you build the infrastructure. Kind of here's the 101 on how to organize a club. Here's how you organize an association. Here's who you want to belong to. Here's where you get the rules, right? Here's how you can begin to build your first event. That's part of what we do as well. So for all of those reasons, I think the future is very, very bright for trail running. There is going to be some not so pleasant outcomes from COVID. And it's just inevitable. That's what happens in any marketplace. But the mid view and the long view, from a business standpoint and investment standpoint, it's actually quite attractive.
Yeah, I think your point that the players that are in the industry, not just the race organizers, I actually look at this from a coaching perspective as well, because coaching market, it's a cottage industry, but there's competition in it. But from a coaching perspective, and you can even look at the other brands, nutrition companies, apparel companies, footwear companies, and things like that, there is going to be this overall proposition that the ones that don't have the bathing suits on when the tide rolls out, they're just not going to be in as good of a position, and they might in fact actually go away once all of this is said and done, which leaves the opportunity for the better built, the stronger, the ones that have better leadership, that have good customer base, loyal customer base, and things like that, to take a little bit more pieces of the market share. And in that case, this picture that you painted earlier of all these wild stallions kind of running around, they're bigger and different animals, I guess, to extend that analogy a bit. And I agree with you that the mid and long term picture is rosy, but I'm still not, and this is just my opinion, I'm still not quite convinced that a huge consolidation of all of that, let's just say that in theory there's 4 big players in the race space, right? I'm still not convinced that that would be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that proposition, when a lot of ultra runners are looking at that going, oh my gosh, these 10 races that I'm used to the mom and pops running, now some other larger organization is running, they can't visualize it, so it's just kind of scary to them.
Right. If just to bring clarity or specific numbers to your point, today we have the numbers. I'd say over 90% are 1 or 2 races for an organizer. It's very fragmented.
Yep.
So there's very few like UTMB or Jameel, right?
Yep.
That have more than even 5. Five is a lot. I'm suggesting in round 2 here that it's still going to be up in the probably 80%.
Oh, huh. Interesting.
Okay. So you're going to have some fallout, but it's not like it's going to go 70% consolidated to the big players. Yeah. It's too mature a market, and it's too fragmented for that to happen. So there's room for bigger players to come in, but you're not going to see this enormous turnover like you might have seen in triathlons, where Ironman, there's 4 players really in triathlons, and then there's everybody else. And I'm not saying that that the Ironman franchise and the others like Vineland and others, they were built early enough that they caught all the growth. And that's exactly what Tough Mudder or Spartan or Rugged Maniac have done in OCR. They caught it early, and they were able to capture most of the incoming. The Stallions, the Mustangs, they're long gone. They're way, way, way long gone. And it's only in the new and emerging markets that you might stand a chance to dominate. So you could maybe do that in China. You could maybe do that in parts of Africa where they're really emerging, and you might have 1 or 2 players that get most of the events. That's possible. Right. But on a global basis, no. If the big players get more than 20% of the market share, I'd be very, very surprised.
Yeah, the other thing confounding that, though, is the scaling is much more difficult because you have, especially in North America, because you have all these permit caps that are 200 runners big. Being able to scale a large organization up in terms of numbers of participants when you have to replicate that race model, that race business model, sometimes multiple times across a weekend, it's enormously more difficult as opposed to an Ironman model or a Tough Mudder model or an OCR model where you can bring tens of thousands of people into one singular race and grow that race or grow the participants just from that one single race. Here, you've just got the proposition where it's like 100 here, 100 there, 200 there, 300 there, 100 there. And it's just like, to do it as an organization is just really logistically difficult.
It's inefficient. You're absolutely right. Yeah. The fact that we're trail runners, not road runners,
right,
and that we are 90+% running on property that's local, state, federal, government owned, makes it so that there's caps, that there's limitations, that there's environmental impact issues. And then we're sharing these trails with all the other people that indeed make it very inefficient. Yeah. Now, someone like Spartan, if you look at their model, they were creating venues where they had control over the venue, mm-hmm. and they could replicate it over and over. It made for a very efficient model. Right. You could do trail running that way. You could, kind of run around a dirt parking lot and do that. And there's a place for that, for sure. But that's traditionally not what we do. Yeah. Most of the races are a little more scenic than that, and thus you can't control the limits. And you're right. So even if somebody wanted to take a dominant position, they would find it exceedingly inefficient, and therefore that is not very attractive as a business model.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. I think it's super interesting. In an effort of full disclosure, I reached out to the Spartan people back in February to bring them on the podcast, and they stood me up. They agreed to do an interview and then didn't show up for it. So we'll see if that tune changes after COVID. This is all before the pandemic came around, but I still would love to bring them on. They have an open invitation to come on and tell us what they're trying to do in the trail and ultra running space. I'm completely open to that, and I'm intrigued by their ideas and their business model and what they can potentially bring to the space.
I'd be happy to help connect you. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
I think that I know they would like to come on. So let me help you do that.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know exactly why the whole thing fell through, but I was a little disappointed that it was, and I would love to have him back on. I have nothing against him. I'd love to hear from him. All right, Bob, we're gonna let you go, man. I really appreciate your time. I know that you got a ton of stuff stacked up for today. Other than the acronym ITRA, is there anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
Just get out there and let's have some fun.
I love it. I love it, Bob. All right, man. Well, we'll see you on the trail soon enough. I hope I make my way out to the Western States course and we can share some trail miles at some point. Might be several months from now, but I'll be looking forward to it nonetheless.
Well, we look forward. You got a roof over your head with us here, and a beer and a pizza in your belly, and somebody to run the trails with you.
Oh, man, that sounds so good. All right, I'll take you up on it for sure.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening to Bob and I today about all things ITRA and a little bit of prognostication on the future of trail and ultra running. And, I think that after this COVID-19 pandemic works its way through the world, we are going to see a much different landscape in the trail and ultra running space. Maybe Spartan is a part of that. Maybe Ironman is a part of that. Maybe some of the races get consolidated. Who knows? We're just going to have to see at the very tail end of it. As a little bit of follow-up, I did get in touch, or back in touch, with the good folks over at Spartan and invited them back on the podcast. Hopefully we can get that out to you folks sooner rather than later. I think that is going to be another interesting conversation. Appreciate Bob for his time here in the podcast. I appreciate you guys listening to the podcast as well. And big special shout out to the new editor and post-production specialist, Michael Carson. If you guys have not noticed, the last couple of podcasts, we have taken the quality of it up a notch. And that is due entirely to Mr. Carson's hard work and really putting up with me on the front end of it to really get these podcasts to sparkle a little bit more. I hope you guys enjoyed it all. If you do have some time, go ahead on over to iTunes and give this podcast a rating or a review. Helps the podcast out a lot. Appreciate the heck out of everybody listening. We will see you out on the trails at some point, and until then, stay healthy, stay safe, and keep training your butts off. We're going to eventually get back to the races, but until then, keep running, people.